All right, good morning, everybody. We're going to get started here with our webinar. Welcome. Thank you for coming to Coping with Loss from Shield Healthcare. I'm Sarah, representing the marketing team here, and we're very happy to have Barbara West with us today. Let's start with some of the basics for the webinar. If you do have any questions, please feel free to click the purple icon in the bottom of your screen. It says Q&A. You can send in your questions about any technical issues, or you can send us some questions for Barbara, which we'll address at the end of the presentation. We also have some survey questions for you down on the bottom with the light green icon. You can answer those, and you can also check out our resources in the dark green icon in the bottom right. Now I'm going to introduce Barbara. She has a long resume, so I'm going to read it for you today. All right, Barbara has received her Master's of Nursing at Yale University in 1993 and her wound ostomy continence certification from Emory in 2011. She has 12 years experience in hospice, and her experience in home health includes working with patients of all ages for UC Davis and Sutter. She held several positions with the Kaiser organization, most recently with Kaiser Vacaville, Morse Avenue, and South Sacramento inpatient facilities, performing full-scope ostomy and wound care. She also has provided full-scope wound ostomy care at South Sacramento, and is currently rediscovering the joys of foot and nail care at Morse Avenue Orthopodiatry Wound Clinic. At this time, I'd like to hand it over to Barbara. Go ahead, Barbara.
Hi, good morning, everybody. It's nice to be here with you. Let's see. I'm just going to assume everything's working and that someone will let me know if it's not. Okay, welcome to Coping with Loss, Bereavement, and Grief. We're going to go through these first few slides kind of quickly to get some definitions. In our hearts, we all know that death is a part of life. In fact, death gives meaning to our existence because it reminds us how precious life is. The loss of a loved one can be life's most stressful event and can cause a major emotional crisis. After the death of someone you love, you experience bereavement, which literally means to be deprived by death. When a death takes place, you may experience a wide range of emotions, even when the death is expected. Many people report feeling an initial stage of numbness, but there's no real order to the grieving process. Some emotions you may experience include denial, disbelief, and confusion. You might also experience shock, sadness, yearning, anger, humiliation, despair, and guilt. I have a quote here from Michelle Steinke. She wrote an article for the Huffington Post called Stifled Grief, How the West Has It Wrong. She was a young mother who lost her husband and really struggled afterwards, not feeling supported by our mainstream culture. She says, "Grief is an ugly mess full of pitfalls, missteps, sinking and swimming. Like a game of chutes and ladders, you never know when the board might pull you back and send you down the chute screaming at the top of your lungs. And just when it appears you've lost the game, you jump ahead." These feelings are normal and common reactions to loss. You may not be prepared for the intensity and duration of your emotions or how swiftly your moods may change. You may even begin to doubt the stability of your mental health, but be assured that these feelings are healthy and appropriate and will help you come to terms with your loss. It takes time to fully absorb the impact of a major loss. You never stop missing your loved one, but the pain eases after time and allows you to go on with your life. The resolution of grief often includes cultivating bonds of emotion and meaning with the dead. People who are important to us may continue to play important roles in our lives and in the life of the community for many years after they've died. My son and I have personally experienced this because my son's biological father died when my son was only 3 months old. So over these past 19 years, it's been interesting to see how both my relationship with Brian and my son's relationship with him have evolved over time. Recently, my son, who's in college, has developed an interest in blues music. And of course, that was the kind of music his dad loved. And these kind of magical things have happened. It almost feels like they're communicating. There's a favorite sampling in a rap song. It turned out it was from a 1971 Bonnie Raitt album that Brian had sent me on a cassette tape, 30 years ago. And somehow, without even knowing it, my son was able to connect in that way. And so as he's getting older and able to understand things more, I'm starting to pull out old letters, and he's getting more of a sense of who his dad was. And then even over this Christmas vacation, we found a cassette tape that had Brian's voice on it. So my son heard his dad's voice for the first time. So again, he's working on that relationship, even in his dad's absence. There's an amazing book about this called A Boy I Once Knew. It's by Elizabeth Stone, and it's the story of a teacher who kind of kept somewhat in touch with a student over a couple decades after he'd finished high school. They sent Christmas cards. But then he died, and she received a box full of his letters and writings. And so over the course of a year, she's going through this box, and the two of them are interacting, her being still alive and him being dead, but somehow it's almost like he's interacting with her daily life. She'll read a letter from him, and it relates to what just happened to her that day, and they're having this conversation. It was a very beautiful book. Similarly, my father passed away a few years ago, and before he died, he and my stepmother had an agreement that he was going to communicate with her by leaving change on the sidewalk. I think it was nickels. And so my stepmom just goes around finding nickels, and she just really appreciates. She knows my dad's communicating with her. Similarly, my dad was someone who always loved birds and was bringing home feathers all the time. And now that he's gone, my stepmother is finding these feathers of these amazing birds in beautiful places, and she takes a lot of comfort in that. So these are just small examples of how communication can happen. In the early days after my son's father's death, I had a lot of dreams, and I would wake up from the dreams feeling like I just had been spending time with my loved one, and it was very comforting. So I think it's important to be open to that. Experts make a distinction between grief and mourning, saying that grief is a subjective state, a set of feelings that arise after a significant death, whereas mourning is a set of rituals or behaviors prescribed by culture. After a loved one dies, you will mourn and grieve. Mourning is the natural process you go through to accept a major loss. It's personal and may last months or years. Mourning is the conventional manifestation of sorrow, like wearing black clothes, a black armband, or flying flags at half-mast. Mourning may include religious traditions honoring the dead or gathering with friends and family to share your loss. So now we're going to take a little detour here and look at traditions from a bunch of different cultures. If you're watching this presentation today, I'm guessing it's for one of two reasons. Either one, you need some free CEUs, or two, you have some questions about grief and mourning. Perhaps your style of grieving doesn't fit with that of your cultural group, or perhaps you're interacting with grieving folks from different cultures and you want to know how best to support them. Society polices grief. It controls and instructs the bereaved about how to think, feel, and behave. All societies have rules about how the emotions of grief are to be displayed and handled. In some cultures, for example, those who grieve should talk to the dead. And in other cultures, the name of the dead should never be spoken. In modern American culture, many different cultural groups live in close proximity. Some of us live within a community that shares our background. Others may be in the minority in our town or neighborhood. But all of us will be exposed to someone else going through the grieving process differently than we do. And some of us may feel at a loss if our way of grieving is not supported by those around us. In addition, many of us have lost connections to grief rituals that may have once been present in our own ethnic backgrounds. No matter what your background is, you're living in the U.S. during a time of change. Until recent decades, most Americans didn't have direct experience with the dying, who often died alone in hospitals, surrounded by strangers. Many family members never saw the body of their loved one, or if they did, it was after embalming, with makeup that may not have been familiar. With the advent of the hospice movement in the 1980s, more and more Americans have had the option to care for their loved one in the home. So as a culture, we've been learning more about death, and on the whole, I think we're becoming less frightened of it. Until recently, the only medically prescribed ritual we had to perform at the time of death was CPR, even though we often knew it was futile. Our medical institutions are slowly learning other, more gentle and inclusive ways of handling the moment of death, and this change in physical culture is symbolic of a general spiritual shift I've noticed over my 26 years of being a nurse. Death is becoming less frightening, and we're finding more ways to stay connected to those who've passed on. When I first trained as a midwife in the early 90s, we were just starting to allow parents to spend time with and connect with their stillborn infants. We were encouraging them to give the baby a name, take a picture of them holding the baby, make a footprint to keep, assemble a memory box with the blanket the baby had been wrapped in. Prior to this, parents sometimes hadn't been allowed to touch or even see a stillborn infant. In the same way, we're learning it's okay to celebrate and cultivate our connections with other loved ones who've died, no matter what their age. Fear of death is basic to human existence. We still see this reflected in Halloween costumes, ghost stories, zombie movies. Darth Vader is scary in part because he sounds like someone on mechanical support for terminal respiratory failure. The evil emperor's pale makeup and red eyes make him look desperately ill or half dead, although I've actually found many of my patients in the moments before and after death to be very beautiful. But death is fundamentally scary to us. As we explore various cultures, we'll see how many traditions have seen the dead as a potential threat to the living. In the past, this fear may have interfered with our own relationship to our dearly departed. But I'm seeing more and more that as a culture, we can let go of that fear and allow ourselves to feel our own sadness directly. So now we're going to look together at some cultural traditions. Except for those of us who are Native American, we're all relatively recent immigrants to this country. Your family might have arrived in the last few decades or the last few centuries. So we're going to look at how cultures coped with grief in their original geographic location and how that's changed or stayed the same once they moved here. Here in Northern California, we have so many different groups, I can't begin to talk about them all. So I've picked a few that I've had some experience with or that I wanted to learn more about myself. It's also important to remember that cultural groups are not monolithic. I'll be speaking in gross generalizations, so please keep in mind there are many subgroups and also variations between individuals. And there are many of us with mixed heritages. For example, I come from a mostly German-American family with over 300 years of devout Christianity, but I've been a Buddhist in a Tibetan lineage since 2001, so my personal experience of death and grief is informed by both of those traditions, and it's also informed by my 12 years in hospice, where I learned so much from the patients and families from many different cultures who allowed me to share in their end-of-life journeys. As we begin to explore how people in different groups cope with loss, we'll see that these traditions evolved in practical ways. If you were living high in the Tibetan mountains, there wasn't a lot of wood or soil, so we don't see coffins or burials. Cultures like southern Mexico tended to have families living in the same village for generations, so they developed a strong tradition of entire families spending time with their departed loved ones at the cemetery. Many modern Americans are nomadic, with our jobs taking us from state to state. So you see more folks buying decorative urns to carry their loved ones' ashes with them when they move. In Korea, work schedules have gotten longer and holiday traffic has gotten so bad that companies now provide graveside cameras so you can visit your loved one's grave from the comfort of your own home. As society evolves, so do our ways of coping with loss. I think it's important to connect with our own particular ethnic heritage, so I'm not suggesting we copy the grieving style of another culture, but by looking at different groups, we can learn a broader range of what's possible, give ourselves more latitude if our way of coping seems outside the norm. And if our own cultural traditions feel uncomfortable to us, we can learn about other options. As Michelle Steinke pointed out, mainstream American culture has tended toward the extreme of not acknowledging grief. So our exploration today will focus on cultures that more fully acknowledge the enormity of grief and have rituals that support grieving for years and decades after a death has occurred, rather than expecting folks to just get over it after a few months. A lot of how we cope depends on what, if anything, we think happened to our loved one after they died, and a lot depends on what our relationship to them was like when they were alive. As we look at different traditions, we'll see that some are loud and colorful, others are quiet and somber. Each tradition is working on two paradoxical tasks: connecting with death and grief and separating from them. We'll also see that many cultures believe there are certain times of the year when the boundary between the worlds of the dead and the living is thinner, allowing for more communication. So we're going to first look at Judaism, which provides a structured approach to mourning in 3 stages. These stages guide mourners through loss and gradually ease them back into the world. One mourner said her journey through the stages of mourning was like being in a cocoon. At first she felt numb, yet gradually she emerged as a butterfly ready to fly. The first most intense period of mourning is the short period between death and burial, characterized by a numbing, paralyzing grief. Traditionally during this period, rending of the garments as a sign of grief is performed. In Judaism, as well as Islam, burial should happen as soon as possible, but may be delayed a few days to allow faraway relatives to arrive. Jewish tradition discourages embalming since the body's return to the earth is seen as natural. Jewish tradition tells us not to comfort the mourner during the time that his deceased lies still unburied. At this point, grief is too intense for any effort at consolation. In my ignorance, I violated this cultural practice when I attended a graveside service for one of my Jewish patients. I expressed joy at seeing this wonderful funeral director from the Jewish funeral home who'd been so helpful with a previous family the year before. But my expression of delight in seeing him was not appropriate at the time of someone else's burial. Once the coffin is lowered into the grave, mourners take turns tossing down a shovelful of earth. This is considered the kindest act because it can never be repaid. Coming from my Protestant background, I found that this intimate involvement with the physical process of burial helped me accept death. When you dig into the earth yourself and then hear that shovelful hitting the lid of the coffin, it helps you understand on a deep physical level that this person has died. Sitting Shiva begins after the burial. During Shiva, mourners take an almost complete break from the routine of everyday life to focus on honoring the memory of the departed and receiving consolation from their community. Family and friends gather in the home and recite the mourner's Kaddish, a 2,000-year-old prayer. Traditionally, it's recited every day for 11 months after a parent's death, and then every year on the anniversary. Visitors who join a family in sitting Shiva are there to be supportive, to visit, to listen, but not to place a burden by expecting false joviality and plastic smiles. No mourner should feel obliged to put on a nice face for visitors. Mirrors in the home are covered and candles are kept burning. Jewish tradition provides a strong framework to channel and express grief for the first year and beyond that. A few more details here. Jewish custom is not to bring flowers, but instead to place a simple stone on the gravestone. Rather than spend money on flowers, it's better to give to charity. In the same way, the casket should be plain and simple, with the extra money allocated to spiritual things that would benefit the person's soul. Here's a quote I found. "We place a small stone upon the gravestone as a sign that we were there. Not so the person who passed away will know, for their soul already has awareness, but so that we will know. We who are physical need physical acts to express reality. Flowers die, but the small, simple stone represents our eternal devotion to upholding the memory of our beloved. Our connection lives on and will never die." Now we're moving on to Hispanic cultures, and in particular Mexican and Mexican American cultures. Once a person has died, but before the burial, the family will hold a wake. In this culture, the wake is much more celebratory and lighthearted while still allowing for expressions of grief. Time for friends and family to share memories of the deceased. Food is served and some attendees might play cards or dominoes. Conversation turns to remembering good times, and laughter is part of the occasion, along with flowers and candles. Children are included, and from a very young age, they grow comfortable with these customs. Often, expressions of grief are more acceptable for women. For Mexican men, breaking down after a death is not the norm. They're expected to be strong and keep their emotions in check. In Islamic cultures, in contrast, weeping for the dead by both men and women is perfectly acceptable. In Mexican culture, the belief is that not only do the dead live on, but that they return annually in spirit, provided their loved ones welcome them back. Like Jews, Mexicans have an annual acknowledgement of the deceased, but again, the tone is very different. During Dia de los Muertos, or Day of the Dead, there are altars with fresh flowers, religious icons, candles, and cut squares of colored tissue paper. Fragrances are believed to guide the spirits home, so you'll have brewed coffee, cinnamon, marigolds, and incense. Other offerings include tobacco, alcohol, candy, soda, and anything reminiscent of the departed, a deck of playing cards, their chess set, knitting yarn. Headstones are repainted in bright, welcoming colors. Families gather in the cemetery to eat, play music, sing, and share stories. The dead are never forgotten. Memories lovingly preserved are passed on, ensuring that future generations know those who passed before them. When my son's biological father died, I didn't know what to do, and I had a hard time even crying about it. Some old friends swept me off to a Dia de los Muertos celebration in East LA. I didn't know what it was, and I was a little afraid carrying my baby in the sling over my shoulder. But my friend kept muttering under his breath to explain to me, "Mock death, honor the dead. Mock death, honor the dead." And I found myself listening to mariachi trumpets, admiring beautiful altars, and surrounded by loving strangers. Being included in their colorful ways of mourning helped me move forward in my own process, and I was finally able to really have a good cry. While Catholicism plays a large role in Mexican and Mexican American mourning traditions, we'll look at some other Catholic cultures and how their mourning practices are similar and different. In contrast to Jews, for Italians, giving flowers to the family is customary, and flowers will adorn the casket. Mourners who follow Italian funeral traditions wear all black, and in the past, Italian spouses would wear black for extended periods of time. Traditionally, Italian funerals had an open casket. It was a common practice to kiss the cheek or forehead of the deceased. Even children would be encouraged to touch the hand or kiss the cheek to show respect. Being buried in the ground is rare in Italy due to lack of space. Instead, graves are stacked and placed in concrete mausoleums. Italian cemeteries are like park grounds where people can wander around and have picnics. If you're lucky enough to have a burial site in the ground, your family will attend and take care of your grave site for centuries. Rural Italian families would sacrifice any small reserve they might have accumulated to pay for the funeral, a contrast to the simplicity of Jewish funeral rituals. Traditionally, Southern Italian culture carried a fear that a dead person's soul might wish to come back, and different rituals were performed to encourage the deceased to leave the earth, such as burying them with their favorite objects like cigarettes, books, or jewelry. Many Italians do not speak of the dead once the period of mourning is over, as they do not wish to summon them back to earth. So you can see what a contrast we have here to the Mexican and Jewish traditions. In order that the soul would not be able to find its way back to the house, the body was carried out feet first. To confuse the soul's sense of direction, the procession to the cemetery stops and turns frequently, and the return to the house is made by a different route. Also, the wailing and lamenting which had begun at the time of death were forbidden at this time, because the soul might hear the pleading and lose its way. Turning now to Irish Catholic traditions, We see many similar practices, but without such concern about the danger the deceased poses to those who remain alive. Irish are traditionally known for the practice of keening, where women would gather and wail in grief at a funeral. There are live recordings of keeners from the 1950s. One Irish musician who listened to these recordings said, "It's like fingernails on a blackboard. Every atom of your body cringes against it. You're recoiling from the horror of loss, but the music is incredible. It's expressing how you're feeling." She said again, "Having gone through the funeral of my own father, you're also strangely euphoric because you've gone through a lot. To be in a room where your father breathes his last breath, you've never experienced that before. Then everybody, your family, the community piles in on top of you for a Catholic wake. Pots of tea and sandwiches are brought in. There's almost this party atmosphere. Everybody's dropping by. You're giddy with lack of sleep, with grief. To bring keening into the middle of that must have felt like you were breaking some kind of trance. That was in a way why it was so harsh. It must have been hard to penetrate the grief." The same woman said, "Our grief now is too contained. We rely on taking antidepressants. We go to a grief counselor. But these people had a way of letting it all out, having a good scream, a good purging." Another Irish woman living in Germany was disappointed by how stilted and tight-lipped her German friends were about death. They couldn't talk about it. Sometimes they couldn't even express their condolences. When she returned to Ireland for her father's funeral, she felt so grateful to the Irish attitude to death, so graceful, natural, so open. Now we're going to turn from cultures that were historically Christians to ones that have incorporated Buddhism and other traditions like Shintoism and Confucianism. Here's a story about a Japanese-American family and some of the tensions they faced during their time of mourning. The story is told by the daughter-in-law Karen, who's a third-generation Japanese-American, relatively assimilated, but married into a more traditional Japanese-American family in Hawaii. Years before her father-in-law's death, Karen had tried to bring up the topic of advanced planning, but it was unspeakable to them. Talking about death is tempting fate. So when Toshi died, there were no plans, and all the arrangements fell to Karen. As soon as Toshi died, his body was taken to the Buddhist chapel in the hospital, and a Buddhist priest was summoned, and within an hour, prayers were being offered to ensure that his spirit was sent in the correct direction before it was lost. Cremation was a given, both for religious preference and since the family plot is only large enough to accommodate urns, and the family must be kept together at all costs. Once she began dealing with the funeral director, Karen felt an enormous pressure of cultural obligations. Consoling the family was much less important than caring for the guests. Will there be enough chairs and food? Will everyone be comfortable? Karen and Patrick had to deplete their savings in order to pay for the event. Here we find a similarity to Southern Italian traditions and a contrast to the Jewish tradition. One of Karen's biggest shocks came after the memorial ceremony, when the family carried the ashes home to be kept until the burial 2 weeks later. She was especially surprised when Patrick's family insisted that the ashes be given a place of prominence at her 3-year-old son's birthday party the next weekend, so Grandpa could enjoy the party. The ceremony at the grave focused on Toshi moving on to another world where he could be of help to those still living. He was given a new name in death, and it was understood that he was now perfect and had joined the other ancestors. He could receive prayers and be of great assistance to the living. They have a family shrine where incense is offered, and each time rice is served, a small portion is spooned out first into a bowl and left on the table for the dead. Karen and Patrick often talk to their small children that Grandpa is watching and helping them. They make weekly visits to the grave with flowers and favorite foods. Also, the Obon festival in August is widely celebrated in Hawaii. This is a time of community dancing, feasting, and processions through the cemeteries. Many Obon celebrations include a huge carnival with rides, games, and summer festival foods like watermelon. The dead actually return to visit with the living at this time, and as well as welcoming them, there are many rituals to assure that they return back to their own plane of existence after the visit. According to traditional Japanese culture, there should not be sadness at the time of death, since the dead person has gone on to a more perfect and exalted existence. But Karen felt dealing with the loss and grief was highly problematic in Japanese culture. In Korean and Chinese cultures, we see similar themes of devotion to those who have died, expressed in daily, weekly, and annual rituals. In Korea, even when people are hospitalized, every effort is made to bring them home to die so that their spirits will not wander and become disoriented, because unhappy ancestral spirits make for bad family fortune. This is the opposite of the Italian funerals, where they attempt to hide the location of the home from the dead. When death occurs, the women in the Korean family immediately commence a loud wailing that seldom ceases in the period before burial. Traditionally, before we had email and Facebook, the wailing also served an important communication purpose. Those in the community learn from the sounds emanating from the home that a death has occurred, and relatives rush in to begin cooking food to feed the funeral guests. Someone is always present with the corpse. My stepmother is Korean, although she moved to the States when she was a young adult. And when my father died, she had a request that I hadn't heard before, and neither had the funeral director in Montana heard this. She wanted to be present when my father's body went into the crematorium, and she wanted to be there when it came out. She wanted to be sure that those ashes were his ashes. And the funeral director was surprised about this, but he was open and culturally sensitive, and he allowed that. And as I was doing the research the last couple of weeks, I realized how her request really fit with her cultural background. In traditional Chinese culture, a 3-year mourning period was often prescribed. These mourning practices would include wearing sackcloth or simple garb, leaving hair unkempt, eating a restricted diet, living in a mourning shack placed beside the house, and moaning in pain at certain intervals of the day. The primary goals for Chinese mourners are to demonstrate respect and provide comfort for the deceased. Other goals include protecting descendants and ensuring the proper separation and direction of the deceased soul into the afterlife. In contrast to traditional Korean practices, some Chinese and Chinese Americans still believe that bad luck will come to the family if someone dies in the home. Now we're going to talk about some mourning traditions that are approximately similar across various cultures in sub-Saharan Africa. Many traditions have changed in the 20th century through the influences of Christianity or Islam. In most traditional African religions, life does not end with death, but continues in another realm. The concepts of life and death are not mutually exclusive, so there are no clear dividing lines between them. Similar to Italian and Chinese cultures, if the correct funeral rites are not observed, the deceased may come back to trouble living relatives. Like Southern Italians, death rituals for removing the body are meant to confuse the dead so he can't find his way back, taking the dead out feet first and following a zigzag path to the burial site. Ancient customs persist in many South African urban funerals. Windows are smeared with ash, pictures in the house are turned around, and mirrors and televisions and any other reflective objects are covered, similar to Jewish practices. During the time preceding the funeral, usually 1 or 2 weeks, visits are paid by the community to comfort the family. The day before the funeral, the corpse is brought home and placed in the bedroom. A night vigil then takes place, often lasting till morning. In the period before burial, there may be loud, distinctive crying which can be heard at a distance. According to a Tanzanian theologian, funeral rites simultaneously mourn for the dead and celebrate life in all its abundance. In some communities, this may include dancing and merriment, thus limiting or even denying the destructive powers of death and providing the deceased with light feet for the journey to the other world. We can see echoes of these traditions in African American funeral services, particularly among Southern families. Nurses are sometimes present at a service to aid a mourner who becomes overwhelmed with emotion, since strong vocal and physical expressions of grief may be expected. Musical performances are presented. A large assortment of flowers is common and may be brought to the coffin by flower girls. For many in the African American community, funeral services and expressions of mourning contain a theme of celebration rather than the somber emotions associated with death in Jewish and German cultures. During the time of slavery, many believed that the deceased soul was liberated at last and returned to their African homeland. From this arose the concept of homegoing, although it's now seen as the soul entering heaven or joining with Jesus or ancestors. Extravagant celebrations of the deceased life became common, typified by the jazz funeral, which could include family and friends marching with a brass band, starting with somber dirges and hymns, but on the return from the cemetery becoming upbeat, raucous, and swinging with cathartic dancing. I got a taste of this when I worked as a hospice nurse in Oakland, where many of my patients were Blacks that had moved to California from the South during World War II. I remember one lady who was positively joyful on her deathbed, as were her relatives. Even though they were sad to be losing her, they were so happy for her to be going to glory. What a contrast in tone this can be to other traditions like those of some Native Americans. Navajo people believe that when someone dies, they go to the underworld, and certain precautions must be taken to ensure they don't return to the world of the living. Navajos are reluctant to look at a dead body. Contact with the body is limited to only a few individuals, and this is the opposite of the Italians touching and kissing the body in an open casket. For traditional Navajos, crying and outward demonstrations of grief are not typical. This is not to be interpreted as lack of caring. According to Navajo customs, the spirit's journey to the next world can be interrupted if too much emotion is shown. So now we're going back to some of these definitions of grief and mourning. Mourning can involve keen mental suffering, sharp sorrow, painful regret. Your grief is likely to be expressed physically, emotionally, and psychologically. For instance, crying is a physical expression, while depression is a psychological expression. It's important to allow yourself to express these feelings. Often death is a subject that's avoided, ignored, or denied, and we've seen how different cultural groups support that expression or repress it. At first, it may seem helpful to separate yourself from the pain, but you cannot avoid grieving forever. Some days these feelings will need to be resolved, or they may cause physical or emotional illness. Many people report physical symptoms that accompany grief. Stomach pain, loss of appetite, intestinal upsets, sleep disturbances, and loss of energy are all common symptoms of acute grief. Of all life stresses, mourning can seriously test your natural defense system. Existing illnesses may worsen, or new conditions may develop. Profound emotional reactions may occur. These reactions include anxiety attacks, chronic fatigue, depression, and even thoughts of suicide. An obsession with the deceased is also a common reaction to death. The death of a loved one is always difficult, and your reactions are influenced by the circumstances of death, particularly when it's sudden or accidental. Your reactions are also influenced by your relationship with the person who died. Some of the reading I found in the last couple weeks talked about the importance of finding meaning. What's the meaning of this death, or what did this person's life mean? A friend of mine recently lost her sister, and her adult children are struggling to accept the death. This sister, their mom, on her birthday every year would visit the hospital and take 2 presents, one for a newborn baby boy and one for a newborn baby girl. That was just her custom. She was a very generous person and wanted to give in that way, even to people she didn't even know. So on Karen's birthday recently, it was just a couple months after her death, her kids got a couple presents, went to the hospital and gave them to a family with a baby boy and a family with a new baby girl. So that was their way of making meaning of their mom, honoring her generosity. And I have the feeling they're going to be doing that every year from now on. A child's death arouses an overwhelming sense of injustice for lost potential, unfulfilled dreams, and senseless suffering. And I want to acknowledge here that the loss of a child at any age is difficult. I one time attended a death of a woman in her 60s, and her 85-year-old mother was there, and it was just devastating. You had a sense of things being out of their natural order and how difficult it was for this woman so late in life to be losing her child when she'd expected her child would be there for her when she was dying. Parents may feel responsible for the child's death, no matter how irrational that may seem. Parents may also feel that they have lost a vital part of their own identity, especially if it was their only child. When I worked at UC Davis Hospice, we took care of a lot of pediatric patients, and there was one case where the family had a child that was a little less than a year old, and they had known since birth that the child had a terminal condition, and the family was just amazing in how they coped with it. And I happened to be there the day the baby died, and of course it was so sorrowful, but the mom had an idea that would make her feel better. When the mortuary van came, she just didn't want the baby to be buckled onto some gurney or in some car seat. And so she asked a family friend if he would be willing to ride along in the mortuary van, just holding the baby in his arms. And so the staff from the mortuary, were kind of surprised. I kind of took them outside and talked to them for a while, and they were eventually willing to allow that. And that just helped the mother feel that she was extending her own love and caring through this family friend holding the baby all the way back to the funeral home. A spouse's death is very traumatic. In addition to severe emotional shock, the death may cause a financial crisis if the spouse was the family's main income source. Recently, my friend's father died, and he had been very ill for a long time, but he was still drawing a pension. And so he fought to stay alive in the final weeks and months, even though the family was saying, "Dad, it's okay, let go." But he was still bringing that income in for the family. A spouse's death may necessitate major social adjustments, requiring the surviving spouse to parent alone, adjust to single life, or maybe even return to work. Elderly people may be especially vulnerable at the time of loss. When they lose a spouse, it also means losing a lifetime of shared experiences. At this time, feelings of loneliness may be compounded by the death of close friends. Many of us see living into advanced age as a positive goal, but one of my patients who lived past 100 said with great sorrow, "Everyone I know is dead." A loss due to suicide can be among the most difficult to bear. They may leave the survivors with a tremendous burden of guilt, anger, or shame. Now I'm quoting from Kay Redfield Jamison. She wrote the book Night Falls Fast, Understanding Suicide. Each way to suicide is its own, intensely private, unknowable, and terrible. Suicide will have seemed to its perpetrator the last and best of bad possibilities, and any attempt by the living to chart this final terrain of life can be only a sketch, maddeningly incomplete. Survivors may even feel responsible for the death. Seeking counseling during the first weeks after the suicide is particularly beneficial and advisable. And Kay Redfield Jamison quotes Elizabeth Jennings, "Time does not heal, it makes a half-stitched scar that can be broken, and again you feel grief as total as in its first hour." Coping with death is vital to your mental health. The best thing you can do is allow yourself to grieve, and there are many ways to cope effectively with your pain. Seek out caring people. Find relatives and friends who can understand your feelings of loss. Join support groups with others who are experiencing similar losses. Express your feelings. Tell others how you're feeling. It will help you to work through the grieving process. Take care of your health. Maintain regular contact with your family physician and be sure to eat well and get plenty of rest, which can be hard to do when grieving interferes with sleep. Be aware of the danger of developing a dependence on medication or alcohol to deal with your grief. Accept that life is for living. It takes effort to begin to live again in the present and not dwell on the past. Postpone major life changes. Try to hold off on making any major changes such as moving, remarrying, changing jobs, or having another child. You should give yourself time to adjust to your loss. Michelle Steinke says, "Time softens the impact of pain, but you are never completely healed. Grief changes who you are at the deepest level." Be patient. It can take months or even years to absorb a major loss and accept the changes to your life. Seek outside help when necessary. If your grief seems like it's too much to bear, seek professional assistance to help work through your grief. It's a sign of strength, not weakness, to seek help. If someone you care about has lost a loved one, you can help them through the grieving process. Share the sorrow. Allow them, even encourage them to talk about their feelings of loss and share memories of the deceased. Of course, if it's appropriate to their culture to do so. Don't offer false comfort. It doesn't help the grieving person when you say it was for the best or you'll get over it in time. Instead, offer a simple expression of sorrow and take time to listen. The Jewish tradition offers a great example of not trying to cheer up the person who's grieving. Offer practical help. Babysitting, cooking, and running errands are all ways to help someone who's in the midst of grieving. And remember that a lot of folks get offers of help in those first couple weeks, but it's months and months later that an offer of help might be particularly appreciated. Remember that it can take a long time to recover from a major loss. Make yourself available to talk. Michelle Steinke says, "Sometimes grief does not even get started till after the first year. Some people say year 2 is harder than year 1. In year 1, there's the shock, end-of-life arrangements, and other business, and you may not have time to actually sit back and grieve till that's all over. There is no set time frame for grief." Encourage professional help when necessary. Don't hesitate to recommend professional help when you feel someone is experiencing too much pain to cope alone. And sometimes you have to just leave the person alone to cope if that's what they're requesting, which that's the hardest thing for me to accept. Children who experience a major loss may grieve differently than adults. A parent's death can be particularly difficult for small children, affecting their sense of security or survival. Often they're confused about the changes they see taking place around them, particularly if well-meaning adults try to protect them from the truth or from their surviving parents' display of grief. Limited understanding and an inability to express feelings puts very young children at a special disadvantage. They may revert to earlier behaviors like bedwetting, asking questions about the deceased that seem insensitive, or invent games about dying or pretend that the death never happened. And I have a story. One of my hospice nurse colleagues who was a mentor to me was a woman of great insight and intuition, and she happened to be at a death where a woman had just died, leaving behind 2 young boys. They were about 7 and 9. And there just happened to be a moment where my friend was alone in the room with the woman's body, and the 2 young boys came in with their little laser pointer toys, little laser pretend weapons that they had. And they examined their mom's body with these laser toys, making little noises, even like looking up under her clothing, into her eyes and her mouth. And my friend knew that if any of the relatives saw this, they would have been horrified, but this was their way of making sense and understanding that she was really dead. So my friend just quietly let them do this. And after a couple minutes, they were done and the other family came in. But I was so grateful that my friend gave those children that chance to work it out in their own way. Coping with a child's grief puts added strain on the bereaved parent, but angry outbursts or criticism only deepen a child's anxiety and delay recovery. Instead, talk honestly with children in terms they can understand. Use age-appropriate language and help them work through their feelings, and remember they are looking to us for suitable behavior. Fernside is a resource for children. They offer phone support to parents and guardians, and they also have how to help booklets. We also have Kids Connected, a support network for children and teens who've experienced a loss of a parent to cancer. I'm going through these kind of fast. These are all going to be available to you after the presentation. The National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization, the Hospice Foundation of America has support groups and bereavement resources. The American Cancer Society and the Centering Corporation as well. They have materials available in Spanish also. Support groups are often offered by these groups as a space where individuals can come together to share their experiences. Oftentimes we think we're struggling alone, but support groups help us see that there are others dealing with a similar situation and who in turn can help us to get better. Support groups are open to anyone, but they're often focused on specific topics, so take some time and find one that's right for you in your current situation. Finding the right group can be helpful, so don't be discouraged if the first one you try doesn't feel quite right. Trying different ones can help you determine the best fit. Here's some support group resources, GriefNet and the Dougie Center, both for resources for children and adults. Remember, with support, patience, and effort, you will survive grief. Someday the pain will lessen, leaving you with cherished memories of your loved one. I want to thank the Mental Health America for their assistance with the development of this program, and their contact info is here. Now we're ready for questions. Thank you for your patience during this presentation.
Great, thank you so much, Barbara. We really appreciated that. That was a very informative and sensitive webinar, so thank you so much. We're going to get to some of the questions that we received. We received so many that we may not be able to get to all of them, but if you submitted a question, we don't get to it, don't worry, because we will still give it to Barbara later and get individual answers. So that said, let me start with a couple here. One person says, I feel that I have not let go of feelings of losing my mother-in-law. My husband and I are trying to help my brother-in-law with his loss. However, we have not really grieved externally. I think we experienced the loss, but not outwardly showing the loss. So how does one grieve when it feels stifled?
Okay, that's a great question, and I'm not sure of the time frame you're talking about, but that's where I've borrowed traditions from other cultures, and also, even if it's been years going to support groups. After the death of my son's father, I went to a support group like 3 or 4 years later, and I didn't think I needed help because I was so tough, you know, and I was coping fine, but going to that group all those years later was really helpful for me. So for one, I would look at those resources. I went through those last slides pretty fast, but go online and look at them, call them up. The theme for me is always asking for help. When I feel stuck, I'm learning to just start asking for help. And often that means, you know, if I'm connected to a spiritual community, contacting elders in that community who might be able to help me. Many churches have lay visitors that that specialize in this. Hospices have bereavement programs. So we have a lot of resources in our communities, locally and nationally. And I just encourage you to go ahead and sign up. And sometimes, you know, taking on traditions from other cultures can help. If you can find some physical way, you know, setting up an altar in your house, visiting a grave if there is a grave, or going on a hike that person would love, some way to physically connect, I find helps us emotionally.
Great, thank you, Barbara. Okay, and our next question here. How would you recommend me to encourage a client who recently lost his teenage son to suicide? He is very private, and I worry that he will not seek help.
That's such a hard one. And as I said in my presentation, the things that scare me the most are the people who withdraw and won't seek help. And there's sometimes only so much bugging of them we can do. I mean, first of all, I have sometimes had fears of other people committing suicide themselves when they're in a state of extreme grief. So if that is your fear, then you call the suicide hotline and get their help, because they're the experts in how to recognize those signs and handle those fears. But short of that, there may not be a lot you can do. You can offer resources, but some people grieve by just completely withdrawing, and that's what happened with my stepmom. I didn't have any contact with her for about 3 years after my father's death, and I was worried sick about her. She was having a lot of health problems during that time. She wouldn't let us visit. She wouldn't come and visit, and it wasn't until my cousin's wedding 3 years later that we saw her, and she came out and she was doing much better. But again, I think it was particular to her particular personality and cultural background. I hated to see her grieving like that, but she's actually the one who found that article, Michelle Steinke's article about stifled grief, how the West has it wrong. And she said, let me be alone and grieve in the way I need to. So we've had no choice but to let her do that. Thank you.
Great. Okay, thank you. All right, the next question for you, Barbara. What do you mean when you said an obsession of the dead is possible? If that happens, what is normal or abnormal about obsession?
So, in the early stages of grief or at different points in grief, there can be a lot of crazy kind of behavior that's actually normal for that time. And that's why these religious traditions have all these things in place. Like at these African American funerals in the South, they had nurses present, during a service to help people who were passing out or fainting or freaking out. So in terms of obsessing with the dead person, I think if you're having questions about what's a normal amount of obsession versus an abnormal amount, it would have to do with things like what kind of time frame. Are we talking about the first couple weeks after a death, or are we talking about a couple months or years after a death? And is the person able to function? If someone's, seems preoccupied with the person, but they're able to, take a shower and eat and sleep and do whatever their daily chores or job is, then we might call that normal. But if they're not able to function and their health or social or financial situation seems to be declining because of this obsession, that's where you might need to take action. And again, seeking professional support for yourself. If the person that you're worried about won't seek support, you can get professional help yourself. You can go to a grief counselor and say, I'm worried about this person's grief, and they can give you professional guidance. So again, the theme is ask for help. And if you can't get help for somebody else, get help for yourself. Thanks.
Great, that's great advice. All right, I think we have time for one last question. This will be the last one, and then we'll wrap it up. And all of the other questions we will pass on to Barbara after the presentation. The last question we have is, I work with caregivers who are caring for their loved ones with dementia, and anticipatory grief is a topic. What are your suggestions in helping others who feel they have lost their loved ones even while they are still alive? I had this with my parents as well. Thank you.
That is such a hard situation when the person may be physically there, but emotionally and spiritually you feel they're gone. And again, I sound like a broken record, but I'm going to say ask for help. That's where those caregiver support groups, and it sounds like you might be running one of those groups. If folks are part of a religious tradition, I feel they're very lucky, and that provides so much benefit. So I encourage, sometimes folks may have been part of a religious tradition in their distant past, but they haven't sought out help. And I'll ask them about that, and I'll facilitate them calling the priest. Maybe they've never been active in that community, in that town, but let's go ahead and reach out now, because I find religious faiths of all kinds, they are really willing to step up for people in these situations. you know, a lot of caregivers, if they're caring for somebody in a facility, they're dealing with issues of how much should I be present? How much is it just breaking your heart to visit every day and see somebody who doesn't even know who you are anymore? And I think caregivers have to sometimes set boundaries. If the regular contact is tearing them up, they may need to distance themselves. And, again, it's asking for help. Sometimes reaching out to extended family and maybe, having a birthday party for the person, maybe that the person isn't even physically present, but you can celebrate who they used to be. It sounds like you have some ideas about this already, and I just really honor you for doing that work because it's very, very hard. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much, Barbara. That was really informative, really helpful. We look forward to getting the rest of the answers back to you in the audience, and we want to thank you so much for joining our webinar today. We are going to post a recording to our website. We invite you to check it out, www.shieldhealthcare.com/community. You can also find the PowerPoint slides in the bottom of your presentation when you hit resources, and anyone with questions on CEUs, you should be getting them within 3 to 5 business days, and you can email us at marketing@shieldhealthcare.com. Again, thank you so much, Barbara, and thank you everyone for attending. We really appreciate it, and have a wonderful day today.